Welcome to Classical Composition. My name is Abigail Johnson, and I've been teaching with Memoria Press for 7 years, and I've been a part of the classical composition community for 8. So I wanted to give you an introduction to it and hopefully show you that it's not only a very solid classical writing curriculum, it's also one that is actually tailor-made to make even the most tentative or the most gifted writing student excel and master writing. So let's go back to what classical composition is based in. It's based in an ancient writing program called the Progymnasmata. Okay, the Progymnasmata. Now you probably heard a prefix in there, pro, Greek meaning before, and gym. G-Y-M. That's right, like gymnasium. A gymnasium is where you practiced physical exercises. And gym in this situation means exercises as well. So progymnasmata means the before exercises. The exercises that students would learn before they did formal rhetoric papers, before they learned to debate in the ancient Greek Senate, before they gave an oratory masterpiece in front of the Roman populace, before they learned those more complicated, intricate, and specifically tailored essays for a particular task or need. The Progymnasmata is a compilation of 14 stages that leads students through 2 areas of writing. One is rich description, and description appropriate for the purpose, and then also argumentation. Now, I want to sit on argumentation for just a second, because classical composition isn't really a composition program. It's a thinking program. One of the failings of modern education is our adherence to the 5-paragraph essay. Introduction, 3 body paragraphs developing your point, and then your conclusion. There's nothing wrong with the 5-paragraph essay. It's good, it's useful, it's helpful. We'll even see it mimicked in some of our Progymnasmata exercises. But it doesn't really go very far helping students know what to say inside the given structure. They know they're supposed to start, obviously. They know they're supposed to have a thesis. They know they're supposed to have 3 somethings to say about their thesis and then close. But how do we help the student find what to say? How do we empower them to have a topic that they can confidently develop an opinion about and then support that opinion? So that's why I say that classical composition is not really just a writing program. It's a thinking program. In classical composition, what we are going to do is not only have the student practice the introduction, transitions, conclusions, developments and descriptions that flesh a paper out to be full-bodied and interesting, but we're also going to teach them how to think, how to develop ideas and arguments about a position. But I get ahead of myself, so let's go back to the very beginning. When students first encounter classical composition, they encounter fables. Hopefully your students are pretty familiar with the idea of a fable, that it has a maxim or a piece of wisdom at the end, and it's a story usually involving animals and sometimes people. These are simple, short stories where we awaken students to the developing skills about narrative. Now, narrative, who's telling the story, what their perspective is, and what their information is, this is foundational to all communication. Narrative. Okay? Narrative is indispensable. So we need to make our students aware as writers about who's telling the story and what bias or perspective they have, how the story changes depending on who's telling the story. not only from a writing perspective, but also from a thinking perspective. If I know that a certain article is written by one newspaper, I might approach it with a very different eye than if an article is written by a different newspaper. We know that bias exists, and it's important that our students understand it as well. But that's one part of narrative. Other parts of good narrative are how much detail. Who is your audience? Are you trying to give just the quick gist, or are you trying to rewrite an elaborate and rich description based on a small story? What does it look like if we tell this story from end to beginning? These narrative concepts of changing around the narrative chronology of the story, as well as taking the story and reducing it to its bare minimum or amplifying it through description, are foundational to mastering the art of narrative. So in fable and narrative, your students will always begin with a story in front of them. And they will proceed through different exercises to digest the story, understand its parts, and then write it again in their own words. Now, this is something I love about classical composition because students never face the dreaded blank piece of paper. Students will always have a model or a story to go off of, to start with, which is very encouraging for writers who are already opposed to writing or feel very unsure about it or have a lot of anxiety when it comes to writing. Another integral part of this is vocabulary and paraphrasing. And this is the art of taking a sentence or a phrase and understanding what the author meant to communicate and then saying that in a student's own words. So in fable and narrative, when students go to retell a story, they tell it in their own words. So they'll work with synonyms, they'll work with different phrasing, they'll work with metaphors, they'll work with descriptions to take the story and, as I say, make it their own. Every year somebody comes out with a different version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And a lot of them are really interesting because it's the same basic story, but told a little bit differently. Or maybe the illustrations are different. Or maybe they really develop Goldilocks' personality or Baby Bear's personality. And that's interesting and engaging. This story that is hundreds and hundreds of years old can be made fresh through the eyes and the pen of a different storyteller. That's what we're teaching kids in fable and narrative. So after students have mastered fable and narrative, they go on to the next two stages, which happen in the same book, Chreia and Maxim. Now, Chreia and Maxim are still based on those same wisdoms that you'll find in fable and narrative. But instead of illustrating it with just a story, we actually teach students 8 different ways, called the heads of development, to illustrate or explain an idea. Most of the time, when people are trying to explain a point to someone, they might tell a story, like a fable, or they might tell an opposite kind of story. They might use an analogy or a comparison, or give an example from their own life. There are actually 8 different heads of development, including background information, an introduction, a positive story, a negative story, an analogy, an example, a testimony or a quote from someone else that we can draw similarities with this quote, and then finally concluding and summing the whole thing up. So these are called heads of development, and these are the different paragraphs that a student will practice in Chreia Maxim. Now, because this is a model-based lesson, we refer students back to the progress and the structure and arrangement of each paragraph as depicted in the model. Now, this is important because the students are not only practicing the skill of developing an idea through different means, but are also elevating their style and their structure by mimicking what is given them in the model. So we're killing two birds with one stone, if you will. The other thing that we're doing in Chreia Maxim is helping the student write slightly longer essays and sustaining that focus on one point. That, of course, becomes very important when they're writing larger essays in high school. So once we've mastered that and we've learned the art of developing what we want to say about a point so that everyone can understand it, we go on to what I call the emperor of classical composition, and that is refutation confirmation. Interestingly enough, and I find this very glorious, because when we believe the classical model of the development of the student learning process, going from grammar to dialectic, then to rhetoric, we usually hit refutation confirmation as that dialectic stage is in full blossom. We teach them to argue. Now, refutation and confirmation are based on the 6, what we call heads of purpose. The idea through the entire refutation confirmation exercise comes down to the 6 heads of purpose. We will continue to use a model to illustrate the development of those points and have students not just come up with a cursory argument, but develop it into a full-fledged argument. But we will also elevate our tone and our style through continuing to mimic the structure given in the model. Quintilian talks about the heads of purpose as places where we can find ideas, we can find arguments. So the 6 heads of purpose are expediency, propriety, consistency, which is later called justice, possibility, plausibility, which is later called legality, and then clarity, which is also called consequence later on. These heads of purpose allow us to take a position and find different arguments for or against an idea. So let me give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Goldilocks and the Three Bears is my favorite way to initially introduce the heads of purpose to my students. I'm not worried about an essay yet. I'm not worried about all of those paragraphs and introductions and all of that information. I just want them to understand how to form an idea. So I might tell my students, let's work on some heads of purpose about Goldilocks tasting the porridge, and all 3 porridges were different temperatures. Let's refute that idea. And a student might say, well, it's impossible that since the porridge was served from the same pot, that it's different temperatures. And I might say, exactly, very good. Another student might say, well, it's unlikely that the porridge was all different temperatures because they had been served at the same time. So it's unlikely that they suddenly cooled at different temperatures, given my experience with how food cools. Another student might say, well, it's inconsistent for the porridge to be at different temperatures because it's all the same porridge. Another student might say, well, it's unhelpful for the story to claim something so ridiculous like porridge cooling at different temperatures. It's damaging to the story. Another student might still yet say it was dishonorable for the porridge to cool at different temperatures because it disregards the way that God has arranged the universe. And finally, another student might say that, well, it's unclear that serving the porridge at the same time caused it to suddenly be so different when Goldilocks tasted it. 6 different ways I have refuted the point of the porridge being different temperatures for Goldilocks. This might give you an idea of how we develop heads of purpose, how we take a position on a given point. Now, we use fairy tales, we use mythology, we use political, historic, propaganda type stories like Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans. We use Icarus and Daedalus. We use Euphra and the Judge. Some of these stories the students already ran into in narrative, and so they're already familiar with them. The point of Refutation Confirmation is to empower the student to have something to say and have reasons why. In Refutation Confirmation, we really give the student the tools to have something to fill into those, for example, body paragraphs of the dreaded 5-paragraph essay. The student now has the ability to invent and discover arguments, where before they might naturally have something to say, or if they don't naturally have something to say, they don't have anything to say. In this way, Refutation Confirmation is the most challenging of the classical composition series, but the rewards of it are a massive, massive leap in style, tone, intricacy of grammar and arrangement, as well as the development of thought and analysis. After Refutation Confirmation, we go into what is called Common Topic. Throughout Common Topic, the students will continue to engage in real life evils and be given the opportunity to invent and understand the reasons why that particular action was evil, how an average person or a person with maybe minor flaws went down that slippery slope to commit such an evil, and also understand in society why those things are so dangerous. So it actually helps them to understand the deep-rootedness of evil actions and how they affect society. And it's also an exercise in pathos, eliciting the ire of the jury and in provoking them and calling the jury to find this abstract person guilty. Again, this is archetype based. So tyrants, abortionists, liars, sentries who leave their posts. These aren't targeted at particular people, but more an embodiment of a certain type of crime. Students really enjoy this stage because they get to sink their teeth into real life problems and have something to say about them, and they find that very, very engaging. After students finish thoroughly vilifying the evils of this world, they move on to a 3-stage book called Encomium, Invective, Comparison. Encomium, Invective, Comparison first praises, then vilifies, and then compares subjects. The fun part of this stage is that it's very, very flexible. We go back to a narrative type of paper, but one that uses the heads of purpose and that uses the heads of development to pull the narrative of someone's life or a thing's existence or the progress and development of an idea, a virtue, a vice. Encomium, Invective, Comparison teaches students to look at the extent of someone or something's influence. What did wisdom look like in its creation? How did wisdom come to men? What did wisdom do in the world, and what is her overarching effect on the world that we know? Aphthonius offers a couple of different models in Encomium, Invective, Comparison because the subject matter can widely vary. This is wonderful because it keeps our students from getting bored with one specific type that I always do this with. So they really are challenged to think outside of the box. After all, an essay praising a lodestone is going to look dramatically different than an essay praising Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, in Encomium, Invective, Comparison, as I said, we return to a narrative style, and that is to help the student see the origins of a particular idea, person, thing, then go on to their development, how they became who they are, what their intent was, what the design was for this object or for this person or idea, and then what they achieved. It helps the student sift through all of the data about something or someone and find the common thread of the thrust of the narrative, the perspective that they want the reader or the audience to take away about that particular subject. Again, this can widely vary. One student may focus on the courage of Harriet Beecher Stowe. One student may focus on her fortitude. Another student may focus on her intelligence and her shrewdness. This offers breadth, not only for the students, but for the teacher as well, because each and every paper will be developed differently, but at the same time will adhere to the structure, the tone, and the progression consistent with the model. We always continue to have models that guide us in tone and development. And this is wonderful because when a student gets lost, we go back to the model. My favorite mantra in class is, what do you do when you don't know what to write? And everyone chants back, go back to the model. So the model continues to be integral in giving our students the tools that they need and a guide so they don't get lost in the open sea of writing. I wanted to say one word about comparison. Comparison is such a fun stage. It comes on the heels of encomium and invective, which is vilifying someone thoroughly. So we deal with Judas Iscariot. We deal with Hitler. We deal with Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or other great villains. And this is not only developing the style and the tone of the students' writing, but is a wonderful way, again, to help students understand evil and then to be on the lookout for it. So it's a wonderful exercise in virtue, as with all of the stages, in addition to a writing tool. Comparison is the last of these three stages in this book, and comparison helps the students go back to those analogy skills of looking at two seemingly different things or two seemingly similar things and finding what's different in things that look almost the same, or finding what is similar in two things that look so very different. So this is a critical thinking exercise. If you're going to differentiate Hector and Achilles, how would you do that? Or is the focus of your paper on emphasizing to the reader that even though they came from different cities, even though they had different parentage, even though they did different works of valor, they really are equally as praiseworthy? So after we go through encomium, invective, comparison, we come to characterization. Characterization is one of my favorite stages because it has a flair for the theatrical, most definitely. Here, students learn the art and hone their pathos. Our model from Aphthonius talks about Niobe, what she would say upon the death of all of her children. Now make sure that you're familiar with the history of the mythology before you teach this stage, but Niobe basically played up to Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, that she was greater than Leto because she had more children. That made Leto upset, and she incited her children to kill all of Niobe's children. And Niobe laments. And so we get a picture, a snapshot of Niobe in that misery, where she is, what led up to her misery, and she deliberates about what to do now. So students are going to learn pathos and also ethos, how to be an authoritative commentator about something, or to revel in the emotion of the moment and solicit the pity or the anger or the joy of the reader. So characterization takes a big break from things students have seen before and really focuses on character development, either the emotion or the ethopoeia, the character itself throughout its life. So it's a refreshing, fun stage and a return to the fruitfulness of good narrative. After characterization and the wonder of looking at a character in a given moment and making that character vividly come to life. We go on to description. I love the fact that the Progymnasmata in classical composition honors the value of description. It's not just something that we deal with in fable and narrative where we're trying to tell the story in our own words and we have the students practice putting description into their papers, but we actually have an entire stage now that they are seasoned learners, now that they have been through several stages. We're going to go back and honor the value of description. Sometimes Americans get a little expedient, get a little, just give me the point. And we lose the richness of a well-turned, well-crafted, and delightful, even effervescent or effusive description. So here in description, we return to those roots. We describe what something looks like coming up to it, what it contains or what it is, and then what it looks like when we're going away from it. So we invite our students to inhabit that space or look at that person and see what it is, what little pieces make up who it is or who that person is. Description is also still based in our heads of development and our heads of purpose. We're never going to do away with those or say those aren't important anymore because they are the foundational blocks of how we come up with something to say. I recently explained to a student that Aragorn has long and regal dark hair, that was a head of purpose. How could that be a head of purpose? And I explained it like this. When I'm looking at the character of Aragorn from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, we would think, what about him is honorable? Or what is helpful or useful? How is it possible to know what he looks like? And that helps us find things to say about him. So then we might go to, oh, it's honorable that he has a regal brow and long hair because it gives him distinction, it gives him honor, it gives him that poise of kingship. So I've gone from a head of purpose, honor, to just having something to say about the character. So again, when we honor and use the heads of purpose and we use the heads of development, it gives our students the tools so that they can say something about any given subject. So going through the description stage, we return to a love of making the world vivid and real to the reader. It's not all just about argumentation. It's not all just about the persuasion and drilling that point home. It's about doing so artfully, beautifully, eloquently. That's the description stage. Finally, in Thesis and Law, we get to the culminating exercise right before students are ready for those full-fledged formal rhetoric papers. The students will actually practice something that many students have done in mock trial or debate, which is debating, should we do this or not? Should a student caught littering be given detention? Or should chewing gum be banned on campus? These are hypothetical ideas that we can side on one side or the other of. And we will continue to use heads of purpose and heads of development to take positions about real life current events. It's deliberative, and students can pick different reasons from the heads of purpose, but they have the opportunity not just to go through all 6 heads of purpose like they did in Refutation Confirmation, but pick the best ones, the best ideas. So they practice the craft of choosing the best head of purpose that's going to fit their audience, their purpose, and be the strongest one for furthering their point. Then in law, students go back to a refutation confirmation style of approving and disproving a given law. Now the thing with law to differentiate it from thesis is that it has almost enough material to be a full hypothesis. It has setting, it has the particulars. It's not an abstract about should chewing gum be banned, but at this school and in these situations, I disapprove of chewing gum being banned, or I approve of chewing gum being banned. So it has more particular characteristics tailored to a specific concept. It's not a full hypothesis, as Aphthonius says, but it's much more tailored to an individual time. We're going to approve of it and disapprove of it, again, to give students practice with seeing both sides to the argument and being encouraged to see not just their instinctive perspective, but see the challenges to that perspective and to think on the other side of the argument. After thesis and law, a student is more than prepared to take all of the things they have learned about heads of development, tone, style, pathos, ethos, description, when to use rich description, when to summarize, how to phrase something and develop it to its full potential in any kind of writing, be it an email to the teacher or a letter of recommendation, an entrance essay to their college, an email to the boss, a literature paper, an AP exam. All of these different kinds of specific writing can be met with the skills contained in classical composition. I hope that this very brief introduction into why we're doing what we're doing has been helpful for you. This is very new to learn. I did not learn this, even though I went to a classical Christian school. And so my journey through classical composition was one that I had to push forward myself. I encourage you to learn the models almost by heart and to expect that your students do so as well. The models are our guide, and the more you examine the models, especially Chreia Maxim and Refutation Confirmation, the more you will understand why the writing does what it does and what it's actually doing. You'll begin to notice things like juxtaposition, parallelism, paraphrasing, and taking ideas and then what I like to call folding them back on themselves. So be encouraged, be excited, use your models, and walk through this writing journey with your students, and I promise you it will be far more rewarding than any other writing program you've ever seen. I hope you enjoy it. Have a fantastic year, and please, if you have questions, comments, if you see things that you don't understand or don't make sense of, please contact us. Let us know so that we can help you, so that we can improve the way we explain how to do things, and so that we can encourage you on your walk through classical composition. Thank you for watching.